The balance of power shifted dramatically, however, when NATO's Arctic footprint suddenly expanded. The decades-long policy of neutrality maintained by Finland and Sweden represented a significant gap in NATO's northern flank. The decisions of these nations to seek NATO membership following Russia's invasion of Ukraine fundamentally altered the Arctic security landscape, potentially offsetting some of America's capability disadvantages through alliance relationships with nations possessing substantial Arctic expertise and infrastructure. NATO's Arctic frontier, how Finland and Sweden changed the game. The Arctic balance of power transformed overnight when two historically neutral nations made a historic decision. For decades, Finland and Sweden maintained careful military neutrality, walking a diplomatic tightrope between NATO and their powerful Russian neighbor. This neutrality wasn't just a political stance, it was deeply embedded in their national identities. Finland's policy of neutrality emerged from its complex history with Russia, including the brutal Winter War of 1939 to 1940, when the small nation fought heroically against Soviet invasion. The resulting Finlandization policy kept the country independent, but careful not to antagonize its eastern neighbor. Sweden's neutrality stretched even further back, having avoided direct participation in major European conflicts since 1814. This decades-long commitment to neutrality seemed unshakable until February 24, 2022, when Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine. Within weeks, public opinion in both Finland and Sweden shifted dramatically. Polls showed support for NATO membership jumping from minority positions to clear majorities. By May 2022, both governments had formally applied for NATO membership, abandoning their long-standing neutrality policies. For Finland, sharing a 1,340-kilometer border with Russia, the decision was particularly momentous. The rapidity of this shift stunned many international observers. Countries that had maintained careful neutrality through the entire Cold War, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Prague Spring, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, suddenly determined that NATO membership was necessary for their security. This wasn't a casual policy adjustment, but a fundamental realignment of their strategic positions. The Finnish president, Sauli Niinistö, put bluntly when explaining the decision, "You caused this. Look in the mirror." This dramatic change fundamentally alters the Arctic security landscape. Before Finland and Sweden's NATO applications, the Arctic Council's 8 members included 3 NATO countries, the United States, Canada, and Norway, Russia, and 4 neutral or non-aligned states, Finland, Sweden, Iceland, and Denmark/Greenland. With Finland and Sweden joining NATO, the balance shifts to 6 NATO members versus Russia, with only Iceland remaining as a NATO member without its own military forces. More importantly, Russia now faces a NATO presence along nearly its entire western Arctic frontier. The geographical implications are striking. Russia's northern fleet, based on the Kola Peninsula near Murmansk, represents the heart of Russia's naval power, particularly its nuclear submarine force. Prior to Finland and Sweden joining NATO, this fleet's access to the North Atlantic was partially buffered by neutral waters. Now the fleet finds itself effectively surrounded by NATO territory, with Norway to the north and west, and Finland to the south. This creates significant new constraints on Russian naval operations and places these critical military assets within easier reach of NATO surveillance and potentially NATO weapons systems. Finland brings substantial Arctic military capabilities to the alliance. Despite its relatively small size, Finland maintains one of Europe's most formidable artillery forces, with over 700 howitzers, including modern self-propelled systems. The Finnish Defense Forces train specifically for Arctic warfare, with conscription-based service, ensuring a large reserve force familiar with winter operations. Finland's F/A-18 Hornet fighters and future F-35 fleet will extend NATO air cover along a critical section of the Russian border. Most importantly, Finland's military has never stopped preparing for the possibility of Russian aggression, maintaining capabilities and strategies many other European nations allowed to atrophy after the Cold War. Sweden similarly contributes significant military assets to NATO's Arctic capabilities. The Swedish Air Force operates approximately 94 Gripen fighter jets, modern aircraft specifically designed for operations from austere, dispersed airfields, an approach tailored for Arctic conditions. Sweden's submarine fleet, though small, is considered among the world's most advanced non-nuclear submarine forces. During training exercises, Swedish submarines have repeatedly demonstrated their ability to penetrate anti-submarine defenses, including successfully sinking a U.S. aircraft carrier during a 2005 exercise. Sweden's defense industry produces sophisticated weapons systems, including the Archer artillery system and RBS, 15 anti-ship missiles that enhance NATO's Arctic combat capabilities. Looking at a map of the Arctic after these NATO accessions reveals the dramatic shift in territorial control. NATO now forms an unbroken chain of territories from Alaska eastward across Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Finland, and Sweden. Russia's Arctic coastline remains extensive, but its European Arctic flank now faces entirely NATO territory. In practical terms, NATO gains control of nearly 7/8 of the Arctic coastline, creating both strategic advantages and new responsibilities for the alliance. Beyond hardware and geography, Finland and Sweden bring invaluable Arctic expertise to NATO. Both nations have invested heavily in Arctic research, from climate science to specialized military equipment development. Their militaries have accumulated decades of experience operating in extreme cold weather conditions. Their governments maintain sophisticated Arctic policies addressing everything from indigenous rights to environmental protection. This expertise fills critical knowledge gaps in an alliance where many members have limited Arctic experience. The infrastructure advantages are equally significant. Finland and Sweden maintain well-developed northern transportation networks, communication systems, and military facilities that can support NATO operations. Finland's road network extends to its northernmost areas, allowing military mobility in regions where such infrastructure is usually lacking. Sweden's northern bases provide potential forward positioning areas for NATO air assets. Both countries have invested in Arctic-capable communication systems that function reliably despite atmospheric challenges common in polar regions. Intelligence capabilities represent another critical contribution. Both nations have sophisticated intelligence services with decades of experience monitoring Russian activities in the Arctic. Their proximity to Russian territory, particularly the sensitive Kola Peninsula, allows for signals intelligence collection and other monitoring activities that would be more difficult from existing NATO positions. This enhanced intelligence picture will improve NATO's understanding of Russian Arctic activities and intentions. Russia's reaction to this strategic setback has been predictably harsh, including explicit threats. Before Finland's formal NATO application, Russian officials warned of military and political consequences if Finland proceeded. The Russian Foreign Ministry stated that Finland's membership would force Russia to take retaliatory steps, both of a military, technical, and other nature. Russian state television discussed deploying nuclear weapons along the Finnish border, and Russian military aircraft violated Finnish airspace multiple times during the application process, clear attempts at intimidation. These threats have been accompanied by military repositioning. Russia has transferred additional units to its northern regions and announced plans for new Arctic bases closer to the Finnish border. Naval exercises in the Baltic Sea have increased in frequency and scale. However, Russia's military remains heavily committed to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, limiting its ability to significantly reinforce its Arctic presence in the short term. How has NATO's Arctic strategy fundamentally changed with Finland and Sweden joining? The alliance now controls nearly 7/8 of the Arctic coastline, surrounds Russia's northern fleet bases, and gains members with significant Arctic military experience and capabilities. This transforms NATO from a partial Arctic player into the dominant Arctic security actor, with Russia increasingly isolated in the region. The alliance now possesses an unbroken chain of surveillance capabilities, potential staging areas, and military assets stretching across the European Arctic. This doesn't negate Russia's substantial Arctic military capabilities, but it significantly complicates Moscow's strategic calculations and operational freedom in the region. Yet there's another player entering the Arctic game, one that doesn't even have Arctic territory. China's growing interest and investment in the region add another layer of complexity to an already challenging security environment, creating new partnerships. China's Polar Silk Road. The Dragon enters the Arctic. Why is a country 900 miles from the Arctic Circle calling itself a near-Arctic state and building polar icebreakers? In 2018, China officially declared itself a near-Arctic state in its first Arctic policy white paper, a designation that exists nowhere in international law and raised eyebrows across actual Arctic nations. This self-created identity represents China's determination to secure a role in Arctic governance and resource development despite having no territorial claims in the region. It also signals something more profound. Beijing views the transforming Arctic as too strategically valuable to be left to the traditional Arctic powers alone. China's emergence as an Arctic player caught many observers by surprise. Historically, Arctic affairs were managed exclusively by the 8 nations with territory above the Arctic Circle: Canada, Denmark, via Greenland, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and the United States. China's distance from the Arctic region, its northernmost point lies roughly 900 miles from the Arctic Circle, would seem to disqualify it from Arctic governance. Yet through persistent diplomatic efforts, substantial economic investments, and scientific initiatives, China has systematically established itself as a legitimate Arctic stakeholder over the past decade. The contrast between China's public statements about its Arctic interests and what many security analysts believe to be its actual strategic motivations is striking. Officially, China emphasizes scientific research, environmental protection, and commercial development opportunities. The 2018 White Paper repeatedly highlights China's commitment to peaceful utilization and international cooperation in the region. Chinese officials consistently frame their Arctic engagement in terms of climate change research, sustainable development, and respect for international law. Security experts, however, point to a different set of motivations. They note that China's pattern of economic investment typically lays groundwork for strategic influence, as seen in its Belt and Road Initiative across Asia and Africa. In the Arctic context, this suggests China is executing a long-term strategy to gain access to shipping routes and natural resources with potential military applications in the future. The concern isn't that China is being deceptive about scientific and economic interests, but rather that these legitimate interests serve broader geopolitical goals not explicitly acknowledged. China's self-declaration as a near-Arctic state reveals much about its ambitions. The term itself represents an attempt to create a new category in Arctic governance, one that acknowledges China isn't technically an Arctic nation, but asserts its right to participate in regional decision-making nonetheless. The White Paper justifies this designation by noting that the natural conditions of the Arctic and their changes have a direct impact on China's climate system and ecological environment. This environmental justification establishes a precedent that could theoretically apply to any nation affected by climate change, potentially opening Arctic governance to global participation rather than regional control. Investment in Arctic capabilities has backed up this rhetorical positioning. China has constructed multiple research stations in the Arctic, including the Yellow River Station on Norway's Svalbard archipelago and a joint China-Iceland Aurora Observatory. These facilities conduct legitimate scientific research while establishing a permanent Chinese presence in the region. China has also built sophisticated icebreakers, including the Snow Dragon, Shuilong, and Snow Dragon 2, the latter being the first Chinese-built polar research vessel. A nuclear-powered icebreaker is reportedly under development, which would significantly enhance China's ability to operate independently in ice-covered waters. Scientific expeditions form another pillar of China's Arctic engagement. Since 1999, China has conducted multiple Arctic research expeditions, studying everything from climate change impacts to oceanography and Arctic ecosystems. These expeditions enhance China's understanding of Arctic conditions while demonstrating its commitment and capabilities to the international community. Chinese researchers have established collaborative relationships with scientists from Arctic nations, creating institutional ties that normalize China's Arctic presence. Perhaps most significant is China's deepening strategic partnership with Russia in Arctic development. In 2017, China and Russia formally incorporated the Arctic into their bilateral relationship through the Polar Silk Road concept, an Arctic extension of China's broader Belt and Road Initiative. This partnership gives China access to Russia's extensive Arctic coastline and resources, while providing Russia with much-needed investment capital and technical expertise. Chinese companies have taken significant stakes in Russian Arctic energy projects, including a 29.9% share in the Amal LNG project and 20% in the Arctic LNG 2 development. The Polar Silk Road concept envisions integrating Arctic shipping routes, particularly Russia's Northern Sea route, into China's global transportation network. Chinese shipping companies have conducted numerous test voyages through Arctic waters, and Chinese shipyards are developing ice-strengthened commercial vessels. Government subsidies support these activities, demonstrating Beijing's commitment to establishing Arctic shipping as a viable alternative to traditional routes. China's approach to securing Arctic resources extends beyond Russia. In Greenland, Chinese companies have pursued mining projects targeting rare earth elements and other strategic minerals. The Kvanefjeld project, though currently stalled due to environmental concerns, would give China access to one of the world's largest rare earth deposits outside its own territory. In Iceland, China has invested in geothermal energy projects and established a research facility. These investments often target smaller Arctic nations with limited economic alternatives, potentially creating leverage for future influence. From a strategic perspective, Arctic shipping routes offer China something particularly valuable: alternatives to vulnerable maritime choke points. Currently, approximately 90% of China's foreign trade travels by sea, with much of it passing through narrow straits like the Malacca Strait between Malaysia and Indonesia. In a conflict scenario, these choke points could be blocked by adversary naval forces, severely damaging China's economy. Arctic routes provide potential alternatives that would be much more difficult to blockade due to their length and harsh conditions. This strategic motivation helps explain China's willingness to invest in Arctic capabilities despite uncertain economic returns in the short term. The ability to diversify shipping routes represents a form of strategic insurance, reducing China's vulnerability to maritime interdiction. Similarly, access to Arctic resources provides alternatives to supplies that might be disrupted during conflicts elsewhere. These strategic benefits justify investments that might not make sense on purely commercial grounds. What makes China's Arctic ambitions concerning despite not being an Arctic nation? China is leveraging economic power to gain access to resources and shipping routes while establishing a foothold that could later support military presence. This approach follows a pattern seen elsewhere in Chinese foreign policy, using economic and scientific engagement to create dependencies and influence that can later be leveraged for strategic advantage. The dual-use nature of many Arctic capabilities, icebreakers, ports, communications infrastructure, means ostensibly civilian investments could acquire military utility if circumstances change. The lack of transparency regarding China's long-term strategic intentions in the Arctic fuels concern among traditional Arctic powers. While scientific research and commercial development are legitimate activities, China's history of using economic leverage for strategic purposes raises questions about its ultimate goals. The self-designation as a near-Arctic state suggests an intention to reshape Arctic governance in ways that dilute the authority of territorial Arctic nations and create space for expanded Chinese influence. With three major powers now competing in the Arctic, Russia with its extensive territorial claims and military buildup, the United States and its NATO allies with expanding presence, and China as a non-Arctic player with growing investments, the potential for misunderstanding, competition, and conflict increases significantly. This leads to the critical question: where specifically might these competing interests collide, creating flashpoints that could escalate from competition to confrontation? Flashpoints, where Arctic competition could turn to conflict. The Arctic may be cold, but tensions are heating up in specific locations where interests collide. Despite the vastness of the Arctic region, spanning more than 5.5 million square miles, potential conflict isn't distributed evenly across this space. Instead, we can identify specific flashpoints where geographic features, resource potential, and strategic positioning create conditions ripe for confrontation. The most contentious territorial dispute centers on the Lomonosov Ridge, an underwater mountain range stretching 1,100 miles across the Arctic Ocean from Russia's New Siberian Islands to Ellesmere Island in the Canadian Arctic. This isn't just any underwater formation. It potentially represents the single largest territorial claim in modern history. Russia argues that the ridge is a natural extension of its continental shelf, and in 2007 dramatically planted a titanium flag on the seafloor at the North Pole to symbolize this claim. If recognized, this would grant Russia sovereign rights over approximately 1.2 million square kilometers of Arctic seabed and everything beneath it. The scientific and legal arguments surrounding this claim are complex. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, countries can extend their exclusive economic zones beyond the standard 200 nautical miles if they can prove the seabed is a natural prolongation of their continental shelf. Russia, Denmark via Greenland, and Canada have all submitted overlapping claims based on different interpretations of the Lomonosov Ridge's geological connection to their territories. Russia's claim, submitted to the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, includes scientific data collected over decades of Arctic research. What makes this dispute particularly dangerous is its symbolism combined with resource potential. The area includes the geographic North Pole itself, a powerful symbol for any nation that can claim it. Beneath the disputed seabed lie potential oil and gas deposits that could be worth billions. Russia has backed its claim with increased military presence, conducting patrols and exercises near the region. The technical nature of the dispute, resting on complex geological data that can be interpreted differently, makes compromise difficult to achieve and creates conditions where countries might eventually decide to enforce their claims through presence rather than legal processes. As shipping traffic increases in narrow Arctic straits, the potential for incidents between military vessels rises dramatically. The Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia spans just 53 miles at its narrowest point and represents the only maritime connection between the Arctic and Pacific Oceans. Both Russian and American warships regularly patrol these waters, as do submarines not always visible to surface vessels.